Thank you very much, Mr. Rector, Mr. President of the University, Mr. Jose Graziano da Silva, Mr. Mayor, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I cannot tell you what a great pleasure it is to stand here to celebrate my alma mater in the presence of FAO, the two organizations where I've spent most of my professional life, and to hear this wonderful orchestra as somebody who has been a former member of one of the Wageningen orchestras. It couldn't be better. And so, in honor of Jose Graziano da Silva, I would like to start with a quote from Brazil's most important 19th century author, Machado de Assis, because I think it has special relevance today. In his book, the Memorias Póstumas de Brás Cubas, the writer draws a comparison between human life and a book. I quote, "Each period in life is a new edition that corrects the preceding one, and that in turn will be corrected by the next." Indeed, every individual life is of course one of learning and of correction. And moreover, this is exactly what happens to mankind as a whole. Each generation learns from previous mistakes, and each era builds upon the past, of past errors and new insight. This is true in every field, from today's theme of food to medicine to energy and what have you. History can be rewritten as a continuous correction course. And in the 19th century, as most of you well know, in the time of Machado de Assis, we discovered gradually all these things that have made our agriculture and our food production so great. We, first of all, learned to harness fossil fuels. We learned something about the laws of heredity to apply them to the improvement of crops and animals. We learned something about food preservation and hygiene. And not much later, but very importantly, we learned how to capture nitrogen from the air and insert it in the soil as fertilizer. And from the middle of the last century then, all these pieces came together and made this great, fantastic leap forward in agriculture that now has brought food to nearly all of us. And more, in the last 50 years, human population has more than doubled, and the amount of calories per head has increased by more than a quarter. This is unprecedented in the history of mankind. Of course, nearly without exception, every application of scientific discovery has led to unforeseen errors and unintended side effects that need, in turn, correction. Fossil fuels, for example, as we now know, lead to emissions of greenhouse gases and possibly to enhanced global warming. We also know that mechanization still causes soil erosion and soil compaction, and intensification of livestock production at an industrial scale has often gone at the detriment of animal welfare. It is true, but our knowledge of feedback loops at the local and the global scale has improved continuously, and it deepens with each error that we make. Now, of course, major inefficiencies still exist in what we do today. Of course, the use of agrochemicals, for example, still gives emissions to the environment, and it has not really enhanced very often the growing conditions of crop and livestock. We have major energy and water inefficiencies in food production today, and we don't seem to be able to overcome them very easily. Now, these inefficiencies exist not because of failures in science, but because they reflect a policy framework that actually promotes them. It pays to pollute because we do not make the polluter pay. Hence, technical knowledge, scientific progress needs to be matched by a policy framework that directs science in the right direction. These are, if you want, in the Book of Agriculture, Machado's great book, the sort of obvious corrections. They're not easy, but they're obvious. However, this great book of agriculture and food science also needs some major revisions. And one of them, one that has been dealt with even earlier this afternoon, are the assumptions about the proportions between land and human population. For a long time, we thought land was out of proportion with the demands of mankind. We now think a little bit differently. Global scarcity will not arise as a result of land scarcity. This is actually a misleading view, because land may be scarce locally. It is also true that there are still major areas where land use can be expanded. For example, even in parts of Africa, certainly in Central Asia and parts of Latin America. Yes, we need to be more careful with land than ever before, but for other reasons, mainly to preserve natural habitats. And we need to explore where intensification is possible and where it needs to be avoided and where we need it adjusted to the local conditions. Indeed, agriculture is the art of the location specific. Most interestingly, with a few exceptions, population growth rates are actually declining more rapidly than anybody had thought 20 years ago. It's very well possible that the population of China will actually decrease within the coming decades, or at least slow down sufficiently to start decreasing by the end of this century. Of course, this is not true for India, it is not true for Africa. But it's very clear that wherever we look, labor will be increasingly scarce and farmers are aging. And that is a major problem when it comes to feeding the cities. We definitely do need mechanization, smart mechanization, coupled with information technology, so that we can use the best science in order to do things like quality control, manage the agrochemicals, and all the things that perhaps aging farmers cannot do so easily, including, as I recently saw in Japan, the use of robots in fields. It is clear that that also means that the current 500 million small farmers that we have today need to be helped very urgently to become entrepreneurs. They cannot just remain stuck in some degree of self-sufficiency and subsistence. They need to feed the cities, and that will be their major challenge. So small, in other words, is not always beautiful in the book of agriculture. A second revision beyond this issue of the land-labor proportions is the concept of food security. The rector already alluded to the concept of nutrition security, and I couldn't agree more that nutrition needs to be tackled in a more integrated fashion than before. The 1996 World Food Summit that actually coined the definition of food security gave a perfect definition in my view, and I quote, "Food security arises in those conditions where all people at all times have access to safe, nutritious food, and food that actually meets their dietary needs and their food preferences to lead an active and healthy life." We cannot better the definition of food security, but it's clear that in a world where today most people, perhaps even 85%, have access to sufficient calories, we need to tackle other problems. And the first one, of course, is dietary preferences and dietary diversification. The world has changed so much since 1996, less than 20 years ago, it's nearly impossible to imagine. So what do we know about dietary diversification? It is clear that the consumption, especially in urban areas, of animal proteins will increase, and also we need to increase the consumption of fruits and vegetables, or fibers in other ways. And that means nearly always that we need more trade and that we need adequate supply chains. And that in turn, of course, requires a far more explicit cooperation at government level between agencies dealing with health, nutrition, agriculture, economic affairs, trade, and education. Because indeed education is going to be essential because the consumer needs to be enticed to make the right choices. And don't think that obesity or overweight is just a problem of the Western world. It is a problem everywhere where the middle classes are rising in emerging economies. And so we also need to have that integrated governmental cooperation coupled with cooperation between the private sector, the NGOs, and consumer organizations. No country in the world, to my knowledge, has even attempted to formulate such an integrated cooperation strategy. And hence I would argue very strongly for a reformulation not of the definition of food security itself, but of the concept and its implementation. Indeed, it is also nutrition security, but beyond nutrition there is also food safety. So I would actually be in favor of a concept of dietary safety and security that would allow the sustainable and healthy production and consumption of foods that people need. And it would be very interesting to do that and to encourage countries to start designing a national dietary safety and security strategy. And in fact, I think that the upcoming FAO-WHO conference on nutrition later this year might be a marvelous starting point to redesign such a strategy and to provide a format for national implementation of this kind of dietary food security and safety. it's a revision of the book, but I will even go beyond that. I think that we now need to turn to the most pressing issue of our times, the issue of the provision of animal proteins. That's the chapter that really needs rewriting. Nobody could have imagined 20 years ago the surge in demand for animal proteins, starting in Asia, but increasingly also, or in East Asia, increasingly also in other parts of Asia, Africa, and also in Latin America. It's not just meat, it's eggs, it's dairy, and increasingly also fish. Since 1950, the global livestock has grown fivefold, and the demand for animal proteins will double in the next few decades. No other issue than meat and animal proteins raises more concerns, political, technical, social, and above all moral. And no other issue has so much influence on consumer confidence as this one. And meat, of course, is blamed for everything, for deforestation and environmental degradation, for habitat destruction, for feed and grazing land. It's blamed also, of course, for major veterinary and public health impacts. Think of, for example, the bird flu. It's even blamed sometimes for obesity. But it's sure that animal welfare and also the abhorrence of large-scale production make us all feel uncomfortable. Animal welfare is a new subject, and it's one that we haven't even tackled internationally at all. Nothing in modern meat production seems to be all right. But don't forget, also traditional systems are not right. There are major problems with, for example, erosion as a result of overgrazing or very poor hygienic conditions in traditional slaughterhouses. So in the animal production chain, food safety is the prime concern. We are plagued by seemingly continuous scandals about food, from melamine in Chinese milk to illegal horse meat just recently here in Europe, from E. coli and salmonella that do not seem to stop. And although our food is safer than ever on a quantitative basis, it's clear that these incidents point to something more structural, something that's wrong in the animal supply chain. It is, I think, a weakness, a combination of inadequate regulation, sloppy compliance, and downright fraud. And safety in the food supply chain, in the animal supply chain, and the overall public health risk of high concentrations of animals, particularly in the neighborhood of large cities, should worry us greatly. There are, of course, scientific solutions to most of these problems. Physical segregation needs to be enforced to have buffers between humans and animals, especially when it comes to monogastrics and to polygastrics and monogastrics more than polygastrics. Efficiencies in feed supply are, of course, far more possible than we currently see. And in this respect, it's very interesting that last year the Chinese government has allowed the release of a genetically modified phytase improved maize to reduce the phosphate emissions from pigs. So there is a lot of scope. More can be done also, as we've seen in the Netherlands, in the reduction of greenhouse gases from stables. And our insight in animal welfare, although it is growing, shows that there is a kind of trade-off between animal welfare, environment, and productivity, and sort of the moral dimension. It is still evolving. And of course, most interestingly, we are looking towards alternative protein sources to at least supply some of the meat or the demand for proteins. Other sources could be, for example, plants, lupins, and soybean, of course, the ones we know, but also bacteria, algae, insects, and other sources, perhaps even retrieval of proteins from wastewaters and sewage. It's quite possible to substitute up to 1/3 of animal proteins by plant proteins or proteins from other sources without losses of palatability. So there's enormous scope to do this in conjunction with the growing demand for animal resources. Now, of course, it is clear that coupled with this, we need programs in those countries where animal proteins and also the micronutrients associated with meat are already in abundance, to make sure that we get campaigns going towards a more flexitarian and meat or low meat diet. I think all that is possible. But there are more problems, and that is that across countries, the differential application of animal welfare, labor, and safety standards may lead to unequal competition and risks outsourcing production to the countries that do not adhere to standards. And this is complicated by the concentration in the supply chain, the upward concentration by retailers wanting to secure supply. There is an upstream integration that leads to the acquisition of food processors by supermarkets, for example, and this dominance in combination with cost cutting really puts us at risk. The current lack of a level playing field in the animal production sector may lead to irresponsible behavior and real risks in terms of public health, animal welfare, and greenhouse emissions. It's a risk to every consumer in the world, and you should be well aware of that. There can be no double standards when it comes to animal health, animal welfare, and labor conditions. So hence, I believe it is urgent to attempt to redesign some of the animal production chains and to think about a global protein supply with global standards, global safety, and a global enforcement system and documentation and monitoring of what happens in that animal supply chain. Because more than ever, supply chains, as we've seen very, very clearly the last few weeks with the horse meat issue, supply chains are integrated, not just within continents, but across continents, certainly when we take the feed issue with us. And so outsourcing, as happens now so often, cannot be a reason for condoning non-compliance. There is a real problem that we don't have clear sanctions for fraud, and that often in the supply chain, people don't even know the next supplier, somebody located at the other end of the world. This is a situation that, in my view, cannot endure because the risks for public health are just too great. Now, of course, redesigning the animal supply chain cannot be a matter of unilateral actions or even the action of a few countries. It really needs to be truly global because it is a global risk. And hence, the only way forward, and one that I'd like to propose to you today, and particularly also to the FAO, is that we need, in my view, a new international treaty, a treaty on what I would simply call for today sustainable and responsible animal production. Now, of course, I am aware that this is complicated, but we need to move forward. One way to do that is to organize a number of roundtables. We have very good experiences with that in sustainable soy production, sustainable oil palm, sustainable biofuels. And, of course, I think it's maybe easy to limit the first discussions to meat production, but maybe later on look at dairy and eggs and fish and so on. And perhaps we should first modestly aim for something like voluntary guidelines. But there are experiences that can help us. The experiences with these outer roundtables suggest two things. You need a very strong and independent secretariat. And secondly, you really need to involve everybody, not just governments, but also the industry and the NGOs. So clearly, I would like to encourage the FAO to really seriously think about taking on such a task of redesigning the animal production systems that we have today and move towards such an international treaty for sustainable and responsible animal proteins. Of course, you could think of all kinds of ways of doing that, having the Codex Alimentarius together with national bodies design some of the criteria, and maybe once a treaty is signed, it could be taken up under the appellate bodies of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And yes, of course, the OIE, the Office International des Épizooties, should play a role. All that, I believe, is possible if there is the political will to do that. I know it's a major job, and somebody like me who has lived through a decade of negotiations on genetic resources knows how difficult it is. But it's just not good enough to leave the issue of animal production to market flaws, inadequacies in the supply chain, and negligence. I think we cannot afford that. And so it seems to me that we must move forward, because this is, of course, the only way, the only real true problem that links us all. It will be difficult because many countries may feel this would be a move towards protectionism or even Western moralism. I don't think it is. As I said, there cannot be dual standards when it comes to public health and veterinary health. So, and I think the reason why I feel so strongly about this, that only with an adequate supply of proteins can we really think that we hope to lift the poor, the undernourished, and also those 2 billion that are not yet born yet, to lift those people out of poverty and out of misery, and to give them sufficient food to really live their life to the full in society. It's the full participation of all labor forces, all human beings, that really makes us great as mankind. And so I feel the redesign of animal production systems, and also, of course, the earlier issue of rethinking the concept of food security into dietary security and safety, are the two big chapters of the book of Food and Agriculture that need to be rewritten and corrected. Ultimately, we, our livestock, our cities, our plants, everything we have is part of that grand ecological cycle. And it will be interesting to quote the rest to you of the earlier quote that I had from Machado de Assis. Remember, I said, each period in life is a new edition in the book that corrects the preceding one, and that in turn will be corrected by the next, until the publication of the definitive edition, which then the publisher donates to the worms. And indeed, we are the stuff of worms. That is true. And that thought should instill modesty in all of us. But we are the only species on Earth who are aware of the fact that there is something like a great ecological cycle and that we are part of it. And it is our task, therefore, to use that awareness and use our science to the full to create a world that really will feed those 2 billion additional people and the 9 million in such a way that future generations, even beyond 2050, will live on an Earth that feeds them plentifully, so that they can live their lives and contribute to that great ecological cycle. Thank you very much.